looking at them as we go along in case she needs to do a bit of research. That's always helpful if you can put them in the chat. Thank you. So first, let's look at a simple timeline to see where Impressionism fits with other periods in art. And dates are approximations, as periods in art are fluid, as you can imagine, and they often overlap. Impressionism, which spanned about 40 years in France from 1860 to 1900, was preceded by Neoclassicism, Romanticism, and Realism, and it was followed by and overlapped with Post-Impressionism. So American Impressionism, and a lot of people don't realize it, it actually followed French Impressionism starting in the 1890s. And major exhibitions of French Impressionist works in Boston and New York in the 1880s introduced the style to the American public, and artists began to work in it. And a lot of the Americans had gone over to France and met the French Impressionists and seen their work there. So before we talk about specific artists and their art, we want to start with a brief historical overview of the period to see why and how Impressionism developed. So we're going to move across the Atlantic and take you to Paris in the 19th century. So Paris was the birthplace of Impressionism, and from the 1860s, what really ruled as the cultural capital of the world until well into the 1900s. Between 1852 and 1870, the city underwent a massive renovation under Napoleon III, who instructed his city planner, Baron Haussmann, to bring air and light to the center of the city, to unify the different neighborhoods and boulevards, and to make the city more beautiful. Together, they leveled entire districts of narrow, winding medieval streets to create an attractive metropolis of wide tree-lined boulevards, outdoor cafes, and green parks. So their first step was to grant large sweeps of land near the center of the city to Haussmann's friends and financial supporters, which drove the original inhabitants to the edges of the city, to the districts of Clichy, La Villette, and most important to our discussion, to Montmartre. Now, since Montmartre was outside the city limits, and therefore it was free of Paris taxes, and we know how people move for taxes, and probably also due to the fact that the local nuns made wine, the hill quickly became a popular drinking area, and the area developed into a center of free living and decadent entertainment at the turn of the 20th century. Cafes, cabarets, and arcades, anarchism and the mixing of classes, plus the radicalization of art as a revolt against the strict academic salon system, all this made for a stunning vibrancy in Montmartre, and no surprise, artists flocked there to live and work. A modern life became the subject of many artworks, and artists sought it both in the city and in the countryside, thanks to an improved railway system that made travel so convenient that Parisians virtually flooded out of Paris every weekend, including artists who found new subject matter in the countryside surrounding the city. These commuting artists required a convenient way to transport their paints. Now, early on, you may know, artists made their own paints from dried pigment powders and used pig bladders, like the one we're showing you here, and that's what held the paints. And problem was, though, that the pig bladders were not airtight and would quickly dry up. Paints in tubes were introduced in the mid-19th century, and this allowed the Impressionists to work more spontaneously indoors and especially out of doors. And by the 1870s, commercial paints were being sold in stores. The high cost of certain minerals caused manufacturers to find synthetic sources for certain pigments. And importantly, because of the use of synthetics, think about it, many new colors became available. Landscape easels were invented to accommodate the growing numbers of artists wanting to work outside. Beginning in France, manufacturers began offering outdoor painting kits that combined a paint box with a portable easel, and these contained most of the supplies needed for a day of painting, and the legs of the easels could be adjusted so that the canvas could be level even on uneven terrain. Now, in the late 19th century, there was only one way for artists to become successful, and that was to have their paintings seen at the annual Paris Salon. Started in 1667, the Salon was France's annual official art show. The Salon hung only conservative paintings that illustrated and taught moral lessons using historical, religious, or mythological subjects. Paintings were classified by genre, following a very specific hierarchy. History paintings were ranked first, followed by the portrait, the landscape, the genre scene, and finally, the still life. The jury, headed by the head of the Academy of Fine Arts, was traditionally very conservative. Near photographic but idealized realism was expected. Artists who won prizes at the Salon received lucrative commissions to create works of art for the government and were sought after for portraits and for private commissions. Now, in the 19th century, the Salon became an annual government-sponsored juried exhibition of new painting and sculpture, and it was held in large commercial halls, to which the ticket-bearing public was invited. And the vernissage, or varnishing, on opening night was a grand social occasion. And you can see all the people dressed up here while you've got the painters up there finishing off their works. The Salon opposed the Impressionist shift away from traditional painting styles. The Salon's academic juries were not receptive to the Impressionist painters, whose works were usually rejected, or if they were accepted, they were poorly placed. In 1863, the Salon jury turned away an unusually high number of the submitted paintings. An uproar, though, resulted, particularly from regular exhibitors who had been rejected. So in order to prove that the salons were democratic, Napoleon III instituted the Salon des Refusés, containing a selection of the works that the Salon had refused or rejected. His office issued a statement, quote, "Numerous complaints have been come to the emperor on the subject of the works of art which were refused by the jury of the exposition. His Majesty, wishing to let the public judge the legitimacy of these complaints, has decided that the works of art which were refused should be displayed in another part of the Palace of Industry." So the Salon des Refusés opened on May 17, 1863, and it really marks the birth of the avant-garde in art. So more than 1,000 visitors a day visited the Salon des Refusés, and critics and the public ridiculed the works, which included such now famous paintings as this one by Whistler. But instead of becoming derided outcasts, the Refusés ultimately achieved long-lasting fame, and history remembers the group as avant-garde pioneers. Art historian Albert Bohm once wrote, "The Salon des Refusés may very well represent the most decisive institutional development in the progress of modern art." Quite a watershed, really, if you think about it. So with this background in mind, let's get into French Impressionism and the artists. The name Impressionism is derived from the title of this Monet work. Critic Louis Leroy wrote a scathing review of the exhibit where it was first shown. He titled his article, "The Exhibition of the Impressionists," and unknowingly gave the artist a name by which they would become known. Leroy wrote, "Impression, I was certain of it. I was just telling myself that since I was impressed, there had to be some impression in it, and what freedom, what ease of workmanship. Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape." So Monet explained the title later. He said, "Landscape is nothing but an impression, and an instantaneous one, hence this label that was given us, by the way, because of me. I had sent a little thing done in Le Havre from my window, sun in the mist, and a few masts of boats sticking up in the foreground. They asked me for a title for the catalog. It couldn't really be taken for a view of Le Havre, and I said, put impression." Well, the term the Impressionists quickly gained favor with the public. It was also accepted by the artists themselves, even though they were a diverse group in style and temperament. They were unified primarily by their spirit of independence and rebellion. They did exhibit together with some shifting membership 8 times between 1874 and 1886. But before we get into a full discussion of Monet, who did this work, we have to step back and talk about the artist that laid the groundwork for Impressionism, an artist that by virtue of the spelling of his name is often confused with Monet, and that is Eduard Mane. He represents for many critics the division between the 19th century and the modern period. His rediscovery of Spanish painting from the Golden Age, his willingness to show the unpainted canvas, his exploration of the nude, and his radical brushstrokes were the first steps towards Impressionism. Manet stressed the definition of painting as the arrangement of paint areas on a canvas over and above its function as representation. Now think of what a big change that was. So Manet was born in Paris in 1832 to an affluent and well-connected family. His father was a judge who expected Manet to pursue a career in law. His uncle, however, encouraged him to paint and often took young Manet to the Louvre. In 1845, following the advice of his uncle, Manet enrolled in a special course of drawing. Now, on the other hand, Manet's father, not encouraging art, encouraged his son to join the Navy. But after Manet failed the Navy entrance exam twice, the elder Manet gave in to his son's wishes to pursue an art education. In 1850, Manet began to study under the academic painter Thomas Couture, a painter of large historical paintings, the type that the Salon liked. So in his spare time, Manet copied the old masters in the Louvre. And from 1853 to 1856, he visited Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, during which time he absorbed the influences of other European artists. After returning from his travels, Manet opened his own studio. His style in this period was characterized by loose brushstrokes and the simplification of details. Adopting the current style of realism, he painted the absinthe drinker and other contemporary subjects such as beggars, singers, gypsies, people in cafes, and even bullfights. Now, this painting depicts a debauched and solitary man within the shadows of the back streets of Paris. It portrays a darker side of Parisian life, which was quite removed from Manet's circle, but nonetheless very real. At the age of 29, Manet received his first critical and popular success in his debut at the Salon of 1861 with The Spanish Singer. Manet's painting reflects the vogue in Paris for the art and culture of Spain during the Second Empire, as well as the artist's own preoccupation with the Spanish. And he composed this work in his studio using a model and props. His hopes for continued early success were dashed at the subsequent Salon of 1863. And that year, as we mentioned, more than half of the submission to the official Salon were rejected, including Manet's. Now, in 1863, Manet married Suzanne Leenhoff, a Dutch-born piano teacher who was his own age, with whom he had been romantically involved for over 10 years. Leenhoff initially had been employed by Manet's father to teach Manet and his younger brother piano. But there's a twist. She also may have been Manet's father's mistress, which created an interesting question, as in 1852, Leenhoff gave birth out of wedlock to a son whose father may have been either of the Manets. And it wasn't until after the death of his father in 1862 that Manet married Suzanne. This is Manet's last portrait of his wife. It was painted at Bellevue, a suburb of Paris, where they spent the summer of 1880. His wife was also a model for the next painting we're going to look at, a painting that caused a lot of controversy in the art world. Imagine, Manet shocked the French public by exhibiting this work. The Salon rejected it for exhibition in 1863, but he did exhibit it at the Salon des Refusés later that same year. The shock value of a woman, naked as can be, casually lunching with two fully dressed men was in itself an affront to the propriety of the time and was made worse by the familiarity of the figures. Manet's wife and his favorite model both posed for the nude woman, which has the model's face, but his wife's plumper body. And the two men are Manet's brother and his future brother-in-law. Now, under the Salon system, there was still a strict hierarchy for different painting genres. This monumental painting combines genres. It features a group of human subjects, a natural landscape, and a basket of fruit still life in a quintessential art historical form, the Pastoral Respite. The roughly painted background lacks depth, giving the viewer the impression that the scene is not taking place outdoors, but in a studio. And this impression is reinforced by the use of broad photographic light, which casts almost no shadows. The style of the painting breaks with the academic traditions of the time, and Manet did not try to hide the brushstrokes, and the painting looks unfinished in some parts. Now, this work was also considered shocking. Conservatives condemned it as immoral and vulgar. A nude goddess was perfectly acceptable, but a nude contemporary prostitute awaiting her client was not. What shocked audiences was not Olympia's nudity, but it was her direct gaze and the clear portrayal of her as a prostitute. The orchid in her hair, her bracelet, her pearl earrings, her oriental shawl, the black ribbon around her neck, and her cast-off slipper all show wealth and show her as a seductress. Now, Manet's Olympia was inspired in part by Titian's 1538 Venus of Urbino. Whereas Titian's Venus delicately covers herself, Olympia's hand firmly protects, as if to emphasize her independence and sexual dominance over men. And Manet replaced the little dog, which is, you may know, as a symbol of fidelity in Titian's painting, with a black cat, which symbolized prostitution. Olympia ignores the flowers presented to her by her servant, probably a gift from a client. And some have suggested that she is looking in the direction of the door as her client barges in unannounced. The painting deviates from the academic style and is characterized by broad, quick brushstrokes, studio lighting that eliminates those midtones, large color surfaces, and very shallow depth. And today, this painting and the last one we looked at are considered watershed paintings that mark the genesis of Impressionism and indeed of all of modern art. Now, Manet remained in Paris, serving in the Garde Nationale throughout the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune, but found himself unable to paint. Towards the end of 1871, he resumed his work using former models, including Berthe Morisot, a young painter with whom he shared a deep friendship and who would marry one of his brothers. And we do talk about Berthe Morisot in other lectures of ours. We don't mean to not mention her here. She was a major French impressionist, as you probably know. So rather than using the uniform studio light he often used in his portraits, Manet chose here to light Morisot vividly from the side, so that her face seems to be all light and shadow. We can only assume that in an effort to enhance her Spanish beauty, Manet chose to dress Morisot in black with a matching hat, and went so far as to paint her with black eyes, even though her eyes were actually green. This composition in blacks is yet another confirmation of Manet's skill. But he may also have used this work as a lesson to his young student, reminding Morisot of the stunning possibilities of black at a time when her own painting was becoming lighter and lighter in tone as she followed the path to Impressionism. This strange and spellbinding portrait was rapidly considered by his friends to be one of Manet's masterpieces. Through Morisot, Manet was introduced to the Impressionists, and he was soon considered to be the leader of the group, though he never presented his work at the Impressionist exhibitions. He preferred to exhibit at the Salon, where his works were still selling. Manet was influenced by the Impressionists, especially Monet and Morisot, and their influence is seen in Manet's use of lighter colors, but he retained his distinctive use of black, uncharacteristic of Impressionist painting. He painted many outdoor pieces, but always returned to what he considered the serious work of the studio. In the late 1860s, Eduard Mane was Claude Monet's hero. By 1874, they had become friends, and Manet came under the sway of Monet's approach to painting quickly, out of doors. And this portrait of the Monet family, Camille Monet and her son Jean, with Monet gardening at the left, is one of Manet's most significant paintings in this new style. But Manet wasn't painting alone at Monet's that day. 50 years later, Monet recounted the circumstances of this day in his garden. He said, Manet, enthralled by the color and the light, undertook an outdoor painting of figures under trees. During the sitting, Renoir arrived. He asked me for palette, brush, and canvas, and there he was, painting away alongside Manet. The latter was watching him out of the corner of his eye. And he made a face. He passed discreetly near me and whispered in my ear about Renoir. He has no talent, that boy. Since you are his friend, tell him to give up painting. One of our favorite stories. So the poses of Camille and Jean are very close, as you can see in both of these works. Manet's version takes a wider view, revealing a much deeper background, and this added depth places his figures in a more specific, more real-time place. In Manet's version, we even see Monet with his watering can at his feet. And while Renoir shows Camille's gaze drifting idly upward, Manet depicts her looking directly at the viewer. The moment feels more concrete. Even Manet's paint appears more substantial than Renoir's. Renoir and Manet both gave their paintings to Monet. Renoir's painting is now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Manet is in the Met in New York. And as you know, we're going to look at Renoir in a few minutes. So this is just a little preview for you. That same summer, Manet was staying outside Paris, not far from Monet's house. And even though he had refused to participate in the Impressionist exhibition organized in the spring, he clearly wished to adopt the high-keyed palette, sketch-like brushwork, and subject matter centered on leisurely pursuits of his young colleagues. Manet chose boating as the subject matter in his new allegiance to Impressionism. And while the woman in the painting has never been identified, the man is Manet's brother-in-law. The Folies Bergère was Paris's first music hall and was notorious as a place for men to pick up prostitutes. And the poet Maupassant said the barmaids were, quote, vendors of drink and of love. Manet brazenly introduced a morally suspect contemporary subject into the realm of high art. This painting is filled with details specific to the Folies Bergère. The pair of green feet in the upper left-hand corner belong to a trapeze artist performing above the patrons. The beer, Bass Pale Ale, recognizable by the red triangle on the label, catered to the taste of English tourists, suggesting a British clientele. And Manet has signed his name on the label of the bottle at the bottom left, combining this centuries-old practice of self-promotion in art with something a little bit more modern, bordering on the product placement concept that we have today. Now, Manet's composition presents us with a visual puzzle. He seems to have painted the image from a viewpoint directly opposite the barmaid. Yet the mirror, look over there to the right, does not reflect the exact scene. The reflected figures of the barmaid talking to a patron are angled away and they're off to the right. And many critics view the inaccurate reflection to be fundamental to the painting, as they show a double reality and meaning to the work. One interpretation is that the reflection is an interaction earlier in time that results in the barmaid's expression in the painting's present. Manet suffered from syphilis and rheumatism, which caused him considerable pain and partial paralysis. At the age of 51, his left foot was amputated because of gangrene, and sadly, he died 11 days later in Paris and was buried in the Cimetière de Passy in the city. Manet was one of the first 19th century artists to paint modern life and a pivotal figure in the transition from realism to Impressionism. He is considered by many art historians to be the father of modern art, and his influence on art and the art world is immeasurable. Manet never lost sight of the idea that art is not specifically about talent with a paintbrush, but rather talent complemented by a visionary mind. While his friend Manet was the precursor to the Impressionist movement, Claude Monet is considered to be the actual founder. Monet was born in 1840 in Paris. His father was a grocery store owner and his mother a singer. Monet's father hoped that he would continue the family grocery business, but Monet had other ideas, and luckily for us, from an early age, he wanted to be an artist. At the age of 11, Monet began his studies at the Le Havre School for the Arts and began selling charcoal paintings. He met Eugène Boudin, who helped him master oil paints and plein air techniques, out of doors, as you probably know. Now, when Monet was 17, his mother passed away and he left school to live with his aunt. On a visit to the Louvre, Monet observed painters copying the work of famous artists. Instead of copying, Monet, who always traveled with his paints, sat by the window and created an original painting of the view out of the window at the Louvre. So when he was in his early 20s, Monet began studying with the artist Charles Gleyre, who's a Swiss painter. Now, although Impression Sunrise named the movement in 1872, Monet had begun painting in the Impressionist style as far back as this painting, and this is considered to be the first Impressionist work. Monet spent many summers in the resort town of Saint-Adresse on the English Channel, as his family had a villa there, and he painted this work in his aunt's garden at Saint-Adresse, and we can see the town of Honfleur on the horizon. Monet was working at the scene, not in a studio. He painted from an elevated viewpoint from an upper window in the house. And as early as in this work, Monet paid careful attention to the colors of the flowers and plants, as well as the light and shadow that plays off of them and the shadows created by the terrace, the chairs, and the people. The figures in this painting are surrounded by greenery, which is punctuated by red, yellow, and white flowers. The white flowers echo the white dresses. Gladiolas, geraniums, and nasturtiums, which naturally occur in varying reds, are painted here in one bright red tone. Now, Monet married Camille Dancieux. Unfortunately, his parents didn't really like her a lot, but they did get married in June of 1870. And that autumn, in the midst of the Franco-Prussian War, the new couple left France for exile in London, where they remained for a year. Monet became fascinated by English parks, especially Green Park and Hampton Court. And here he has painted a panorama of Green Park. During the time of the Impressionists, many of the first public gardens were built in cities around the world, and many former royal gardens were renovated as they were made public. Such spaces provided fresh air and beautiful promenades for everyone. The expansion of the pleasure garden to the middle class is one of the developments of the late 19th century that has only increased in importance over time. Now, although Monet's paintings were turned down by London's Royal Academy, he refused to give up, and instead Monet and Camille moved to the Netherlands, where Monet continued painting, and in the fall of 1871, they returned to France and settled in Argenteuil, near Paris. Now, the town of Argenteuil lies on the banks of the Seine just outside the city, and during the 1870s and 80s, Argenteuil became an important source of inspiration for the Impressionist artists. And they immortalized its river views, its bridges, streets, and gardens in their paintings. And this painting is done in the garden at the Monet's rented house. Even though it was a rented property, Monet cultivated the garden himself, and this one he made into more of an orchard with a lot of flowers. Here, Camille is sitting on a garden bench. Camille's father had sadly recently passed away, which is why Monet has painted her looking sad. It is thought that the man in the top hat, who has been identified as a neighbor of the Monets, has come by to offer his condolences and has brought a bouquet which lays next to Camille on the bench. Behind Camille, Monet has painted mounds of red geraniums, which leads our eye from Camille and the man back to the woman with the parasol in the background. Now, this composition gives us a sense of Monet's happiness during the summer of 1873, when his fortunes were at their brightest. Monet had a loyal dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, and his paintings were selling well. He and Camille had one son, Jean, whom we see in the foreground playing with a hoop, and the Monets were quite prosperous, as we can see by their large house. Monet was at last living in the bourgeois style of his own family, who had virtually disowned him for his profession and his alliance with Camille. By this time, 2 years after they had rented the house, the flowers were in full bloom, and Monet had begun to use the garden in his paintings, and the series of Dutch blue and white pots had probably been purchased by Monet on a trip he had taken to Holland. Sadly, this beautiful setting was not a permanent one for the Monets. Monet's success was short-lived, and his fortunes were gradually depleted. The family was forced to leave their house for smaller and cheaper quarters in 1874. And adding to their misfortune, Camille became ill with tuberculosis. Their second son, Michel, was born in 1878, and his birth weakened her already fading health. The Monets moved to the village of Vetoy, where they shared a house with the family of Ernest Hocheday, who was a wealthy department store owner and patron of the arts. Vetoy is about 40 miles from Paris, and the families lived there in a modest house close to the River Seine. The town provided Monet with an opportunity to cultivate the riverbank garden, whose climbing nasturtiums he represented with swirls and splashes of orange in this composition. And when a friend asked if he might visit Monet's studio, Monet answered, "My studio? But I've never had one, and I don't understand how anyone could shut themselves into a room, perhaps to draw, but not to paint." Now, Camille was diagnosed with uterine cancer, and she died on the 5th of September, 1879, at the very young age of 32. And Monet became close with Ernest Hocheday's wife, Alice, and this is a painting of her in the garden of the house. Ernest, the husband, spent most of his time in Paris, and after Camille's death, Monet and Alice, along with all of their children, continued living together at Vetoy. Always restless, the Monets were to move one final time. Monet had married Alice after Ernest had ended up dying. They did wait till he was gone, but there was clearly something going on. It is said that Monet spotted the village of Giverny while riding on a train in Normandy. And the story goes that he saw this charming village and just got off the train. He walked until the first pub, sat down, had a big jug of cider, and talked to the local people. Monet learned that a local carpenter had recently inherited a farm that he didn't need. In 1883, Monet and Alice, along with his 2 children and her 6, moved into Giverny, and they lived there for the rest of their lives. The decision to move to Giverny clearly had one motivation. There was lots of land, which was cheap and open to cultivation, and the land around the house at Giverny gave Monet the opportunity to create the gardens that he had been dreaming of during all the time he'd been renting. He was finally able to plant the gardens that he wanted to paint. In all, Monet painted over 500 works based on his gardens, and Monet himself described his garden as his greatest work of art. In the 1870s, Monet began painting subjects as a series in different seasons and at different times of day. Between the summer of 1890 and the winter of 1891, Monet painted about 30 paintings of the haystacks in a field near his house at Giverny. In the midst of this effort, he wrote to an art critic, "I am working very hard, struggling with a series of different effects, but at this season the sun sets so fast, I cannot follow it. The more I continue, the more I see that a great deal of work is necessary in order to succeed in rendering what I seek." And other series paintings you may know of are Rouen Cathedral, Parliament, Mornings on the Seine, and Lilies. Monet's lily paintings are on display at museums all over the world. I'd be amazed if you have not seen at least one of them. So 10 years after he originally purchased Giverny, Monet purchased more land with a pond nearby, intending to build something, in his words, for the pleasure of the eye and also for motifs to paint. This is one of 3 early canvases Monet painted after he installed the Japanese-style footbridge over the pond on that new property. Monet began a series of views of the footbridge, completing 12 paintings, including this one, which exhibited at Durand Ruel's gallery in Paris the following year. The vertical format of this painting is unusual in this series, but it gives prominence to the water lilies and their reflections on the pond. Monet had always been interested in reflections, seeing their fragmented forms as a natural equivalent for his own broken brushwork. In the last decades of Monet's life, his prized water garden at Giverny became a subject the artist explored obsessively, and eventually it was his only subject. In Monet's latest lily pond paintings, even more of the setting disappears and the water's surface occupies the entire canvas. By the time this was painted, Monet had developed cataracts that affected his ability to see accurate colors. He even went back and adjusted some of the colors in his paintings after having eye surgery. Monet's water lily paintings became even more abstract after this and are considered to be modern, not impressionist art. Monet died at the age of 86 on December 5th, 1926 from lung cancer. He's buried in the cemetery of the Giverny Church, and his heirs bequeathed his Giverny home and gardens to the French Academy of Fine Arts in 1966, and they are open to the public. And if you are ever in the area, it is certainly worth a visit. And our last artist, last but not least, is Pierre Auguste Renoir. And he was born in 1841 into a working class family. He was one of 7 children, and his father was a tailor. The family moved to Paris when Renoir was 4. Renoir demonstrated his artistic talent at an early age. By 13, he was an apprentice in a porcelain factory where he learned to decorate their porcelain pieces with flowers. These 2 pieces are miniatures. The cup is only a ½ inch tall, and the saucer is 1 inch in diameter. As we'll see, Renoir went on to become one of the greatest flower painters in the history of art. When he was 21, Renoir began to take evening courses in drawing and anatomy at the École des Beaux-Arts, as well as painting lessons at the studio of Charles Gleyre, alongside Monet and other Impressionist artists. Painted 6 years before the first Impressionist exhibition, This painting provides insight into Renoir's developing Impressionist style. This painting illustrates an Impressionist technique of placing figures in sharp focus against a blurred background. The background gives a hint of the open-air portraits the Impressionists would paint some years later, but here the figures and faces are painted with no attempt to suggest outdoor lighting. Renoir shows an affectionate moment caught in time, the totally spontaneous impression of what he would have seen if he had run into a couple out walking. But Renoir did not run across them, but has staged this simple and everyday happening. While this work is moving towards Impressionism, in the composition and in the treatment of the light, we still see the strong traditions of academic painting. Renoir's style here shows the influence of realist painter Courbet, and this is one of the few times Renoir used a palette knife to apply his pigments, which was a favorite technique of Courbet's. And Renoir wrote that he had produced this painting as a study of a nude, the sort of exercise that was a mainstay of the academic tradition. Note that the woman's foot rests on an elevated perch, and the strain of her raised arms is relieved by a prop. Such devices were necessary for a model to maintain her pose. This model is Lise Tréault, the artist's mistress, and in the end, as Renoir admitted, quote, "The picture was considered pretty improper." He said he added the bow, the dead animal, and the deerskin to transform Lise into Diana, the ancient goddess of the hunt, whose nudity would be more acceptable to a salon jury. However, undisguised by its mythological theme, the jury was not fooled, and the painting was rejected when Renoir submitted it to the Salon in 1867. But the same year, the Salon accepted this painting of Lise. Renoir was 24 years old when he met Lise, who was 16, and she became Renoir's favorite model and mistress. He painted her more than 20 times between 1865 and 1872, and Lise would be the first of many women in Renoir's life who would in turn appear in his paintings. In 1872, they separated. Lise married soon after, and they never saw each other again. Painted in 1874 and shown in the first Impressionist exhibition of that year, this painting depicts a fashionable couple at the theater. In Paris, theater attendance was rapidly growing during the 19th century, dominating the cultural life of the city. The growing wealth of the middle classes meant that the loges of the top theaters were no longer just for high society, and this painting epitomizes the Impressionist interest in the spectacle of modern life. Now, we can't know whether the curtain has already gone up because at this date, house lights were not dimmed. As the viewer, we see the anonymous man and woman from the same level in close-up, implying that we are seated opposite and watching them through opera glasses. Renoir's brother Edmond and Nini Lopez, a model from Montmartre, pose for this ambitious composition. At the heart of the painting is the complex play of their gazes. The man has raised his binoculars to look to the upper balconies, presumably to get a closer look at a beautiful woman. But his companion, most likely his mistress, sits still with her opera glasses lowered. She appears lost in thought, unaware of being observed. She may be aware that her partner has begun to look at other women and that she may not have much time left to find his successor. If she is a courtesan, then her passive demeanor has a purpose. She is signaling her availability by displaying her charms for all to see, well aware that the eyes of every man in the theater are on her. While most artists participating in the Impressionist exhibitions were ridiculed, Renoir's star continued to rise. He received valuable support from patrons, art dealers, and collectors, and was frequently commissioned to paint family portraits. This painting was commissioned by the publisher Georges Charpentier, whose stable of authors included Flaubert and Zola. His wife, Marguerite, was a notable art collector, and the couple regularly hosted artists and writers at their Thursday dinners. Of the artists, Renoir was the one most frequently at their house. At this time, France was developing trade with the Orient, and here the bamboo furniture, the Chinese rug, and the Japanese screen reflect the couple's up-to-date style. Marguerite is with her 2 children and the family dog. And will it surprise you to learn that one of the children is a girl and the other one is actually a boy? One is Paul and the other his sister, Georgette. Following the fashion of the time, Paul's hair had not yet been cut and his clothes matched those of his sister. And it was common in Europe for little boys to wear dresses until the age of 5, then short pants until they were 10. Now, can you tell who's who? 6-year-old Georgette wearing a gold bracelet perches on the family dog. Madame Charpentier used her influence to ensure that this painting was hung in a choice spot at the salon and introduced Renoir to her friends, several of whom commissioned work from him. Now, Renoir often showed fellow artists in his works. In this very famous work, and I'm sure you recognize it, Renoir gave prominence to his fellow artist Gustave Caillebotte, an avid boatman who painted many images of river sports. And he gazes across the table at a young woman who affectionately plays with her dog. She is Hélène Charigot, a 21-year-old seamstress Renoir had recently met and would later marry. And to make Hélène stand out, Renoir put detail into her outfit and used warm reds and oranges in the flowers on her hat. She is the only person who does not flirt with someone else in the painting, but instead focuses on her dog, a traditional symbol of fidelity. This painting conveys the lighthearted, leisurely mood of the Maison Fournaise just outside of Paris. And the Industrial Revolution had shortened the work week, so everyone from seamstresses to shop workers could enjoy the pleasures of the suburbs. During these years, Renoir supported himself by painting marketable works such as portraits and floral still lifes. Certain flowers have come to be associated with certain artists, and in the case of Renoir, it's roses. Renoir painted them throughout his career, and we can see the change in his style. Earlier roses were painted in more detail and in a larger setting, but as time went on, the roses themselves filled the canvas. As Renoir later explained, I just let my brain rest when I paint flowers. I don't experience the same tension as I do when confronted by the model. I establish the tones. I study the values carefully without worrying about losing the picture. I don't dare do this with a figure piece for fear of ruining it. And Renoir said that painting roses helped him to capture the skin tones of women and children. And these two girls may look familiar to you because Renoir painted them over and over. Between 1888 and 1892, Renoir painted a number of works in which the same pair of girls, the blonde wearing a white dress and the brunette a pink one, engage in leisurely pastimes. The girl in pink is Julie Manet, the daughter of fellow impressionist Berthe Morisot, and her husband, Eugene Mane, the brother of Eduard Mane. And the fair-haired girl in white is Julie's cousin Jean. Renoir spent time at the Manets' country house, and the girls posed for him many times. Genre scenes like these, celebrating youthful innocence, were very popular at the time. After 1900, Renoir continued to paint. However, rheumatism had disfigured his hands, leaving his fingers permanently curled. Renoir also had a stroke in 1912, which left him in a wheelchair. He worked with assistants to create works based on some of his paintings. Hélène, who suffered from diabetes, died in 1915 at the age of 56. Renoir continued to paint until his death. He lived long enough to have had the extraordinary experience of visiting the Louvre to see his paintings hanging with the old masters. He died at home on December 3rd, 1919, at the age of 78. Renoir is perhaps the best loved of all the Impressionists for his subjects. Pretty children, flowers, beautiful scenes, and above all, lovely women have an instant appeal. Renoir communicated the joy he took in them with great directness. He said, "Why shouldn't art be pretty? There are enough unpleasant things in the world." So we want to thank you for coming. We hope you've enjoyed hearing about some of the French Impressionists. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and switch over to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, we had a couple of questions, Robin. One, going back to the Le Déjeuner Célèbre, they wanted to know who the female nude was. She was one of Manet's most favorite models, most often used at that time, named Victorine Moret, and not a love interest as best we can tell. And the man on the right was a combination of Manet's two brothers, Eugene and Gustave. And similarly, someone asked about the Folie Bergère painting, who the man was in the mirror. Both the man and the woman were models, but it is believed that the woman who was the model actually did perform as a cabaret singer. And the man was another painter who happened to live next door to Manet. It was a neighbor named Henri Dupré. We don't know much about him. They said he was a military painter, but both people were strictly models for the painting. So I don't see any, we've got to thank you. Yes, thank you. Those are good. Any other questions, put them in the chat label, or you're also welcome, I think at this point, if you want to unmute yourselves, if you know how to do that, we'd be happy to talk with you.
And again, we want to thank Nancy, and we want to thank the Milford Library for having us. We hope if you enjoyed tonight's presentation and you want to see us back there, that you'll have a word with Nancy. We had a great time being here, and hope to see you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
This was really, really fabulous. Thank you very much. Thank you both very much. I'm sure that everyone who was here this evening really enjoyed it. And I hope we have you back again. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, that's high praise from you, Nancy. Thank you so much, because I know you've got a bit of a background in art history. So thank you. Thank you for your kind words.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Great presentation. Good night, everyone. Thank you
You're welcome.
for
Good-
coming.
Thanks, Robin and Jody and Nancy.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night. Thank you, everyone. This would really, I just,
Oh, good. Oh, you've made my evening.
just great, just great.
Oh, good. That's one of our favorites, and you can see why. It's just,
Yeah,
it's a lot of fun to
absolutely.
give, and it really is a lot of pretty art, but they did some art that was not so pretty too. You
Yeah,
know, and we love also giving the background on them. Yeah, I think that just seeing the development of an artist is wonderful.
it's so important to know the the background and all of the little things and, little touches that make you understand the work a little more.
Exactly.
Really beautiful. Thank you. I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Wonderful. Enjoy. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night, everyone.